Since Halloween is coming and going, and I've only managed to read one scary story, which is the whole Ben Drowned ARG, and I didn't even read through the entire thing, but I kind of skimmed and scanned through most of it. But since it is the Halloween season, I figure I should probably get some actual scary stuff in. So I'm just going to be releasing this video, which will be a compilation of an undetermined amount of creepypastas that I have found. That'll be determined by how long it takes me to read these. So sit back, relax, get a little spooked, and I hope you enjoy. We will be starting with 1483 by X Astromoth X. I had the dream again, the little boy whispered to his brother, shaking him violently awake. I think I really felt this time. He hugged his older brother tight as the other sat up and rubbed his face. The little boy blinked rapidly to rid himself of the tears in his eyes as his brother rubbed reassuring circles into his back. It was just a dream, Richard, he insisted to the 9-year-old. It's nothing to worry about. But it was scary, Richard protested. The lopsided man came in the room and he grabbed me by the throat until I couldn't breathe. Richard, his brother growled at the sound of the man's given moniker. I told you to stop calling him that. The boy pulled away and crawled to the end of the bed, lower lip trembling and pout. Well, that's just what he is, he mumbled. His shoulders, they're at different heights and that makes him look really funny. I know, but it's still not nice to say. His brother scolded the boy with a sigh, crawling after him. He wrapped an arm around the younger boy and let him lean on his shoulder for comfort. When are you going to be king, Edward? The little boy asked with a frown, turning his head to look up at the 12-year-old. Soon, Edward said, getting to his feet. It'll be soon. He wandered over to the window, looking out over the grounds of the tower. It was quiet, dead quiet, but Edward was certain the guards were alert at their posts. I'm sure of it. You said it'd be soon when I got here, and that was 2 months ago, Richard pointed out, his expression changing from that of disappointment to that of irritation. Before that, you were here a month already. It's not up to me, Edward called back, refusing to look back at his brother. He hung his head and let a heavy sigh, fists unclenching. We're here until they coronate me. They're going to have to do it sometime. They can't keep us in here forever. What if they never do? Richard asked, sitting cross-legged. What if the lopsided... He's our uncle, Richard. You need to stop calling him that, no matter how he looks, Edward growled, spinning on his heel and glaring at the boy. I bet he wouldn't be very happy to hear you say that about him. I'm sorry, Richard said, looking down at his feet as a flush covered his face. Edward let out another sigh and climbed back into bed. It was just a dream, Richard. Please, let me go back to sleep and get some rest yourself. We'll ask about coronation tomorrow. Richard's eyes lit up in the moonlight. Really? You promise? He asked. Edward laughed and nodded, patting the spot on the bed beside him. Of course. Now come on. Richard worked himself back under the covers and the brothers fell back asleep. In August of 1483, Edward V and his brother Richard stopped coming out of the Tower of London. Edward V's coronation never occurred, despite his placement in the tower assumed to be for that purpose. Some claim that their uncle Richard III, spine deformed by scoliosis, murdered them to secure his place on the throne. To this day, no one knows for certain. Every year, during a period from 1946 to 1952, the residents of a small town in western Germany heard what resembled a 6-gun salute on the 15th of every March. Some residents made frequent trips into the surrounding hills in hopes of finding the source of the noise, but to no avail. The townsfolk eventually named the area Gunpowder Hill. The children of the town even created a legend about it, stating that soldiers, who in the time were missing, had been executed and were buried somewhere in the hill. The purpose of the 6-gun salute was to guide people to the location of the men. On the 15th of March every year, The children would gather at the edge of town, eagerly awaiting the 6 gunshots to be heard. In late 1951, the hills on the outskirts of the small German town were surveyed for the future construction of a NATO military site. The military base was to consist of a series of deep underground bunkers and weapons supplies in the case of a Soviet invasion. February 1952, construction began. Just 4 weeks later, the crew began digging a massive 200-foot deep hole for the future underground storage bunkers. It was during this time that the crew made a morbid discovery. As they neared the end of the digging operation, a human hand was seen sticking out of the bottom of the hole. Upon further examination, 27 bodies were discovered at the bottom of a 200-foot deep hole, dressed in prisoner of war uniforms worn by the Allies in Nazi war camps. A NATO officer ordered for the bodies to be exhumed immediately. As the medical team watched the bodies being carried out of the hole, they looked in puzzlement. The bodies were remarkably well preserved. Furthermore, the POW uniforms bore a strange insignia unlike any of the men they had seen before, an orange circle with a single black dash in the middle. However, the most unsettling characteristic was their faces. Their eyes were wide open, and their mouths were sealed shut with an unknown adhesive. The bodies were immediately dispatched to the local morgue for identification and pathological examination. That night, the local mortician began his work. He found it difficult to concentrate on his task. The eyes of the first man he was to begin work on seemed to be staring back at him. The mortician took his scalpel and began his first cut. Blood poured out of the incision with staggering force. The mortician backed away from the table in shock. The red liquid began running down the table, pooling on the floor below. The eyes of the body began watering and streaks of tears rained down its face. Soon, its eyes rolled back into its head. The bleeding ceased. In horror, the mortician ran to the door, but not before catching a glance of the 26 other bodies lying out on separate tables. Their eyes stared at him with hopeless fear. The men were still alive. Berlin, Germany, April 30th, 1945. Fate had taken its course. Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany, allowed the tears to fall freely from his face. His wife, Eva Braun Hitler, lay beside him, the cyanide-induced seizures finally subsiding. He did not cry for her, though he felt her absence profoundly. No, Hitler cried for the death of Germany, the total devastation that had been visited on his country and his people. As if on cue, the walls shuddered as more Slavic shells pounded the lands he had ruled absolutely for over 12 years. Above, the men and women of his country were being slaughtered and brutalized. The thought of his capital and his people under the thrall of the Marxist Untermensch was horrific, and yet now it seemed inevitable. If only Great Britain had seen the value in alliance, if only his generals had led better against the Soviets, if only. Hitler's hands shook so violently at his thoughts that he dropped a cyanide capsule and handgun. His body was deteriorating. The disease he had carried with him since his early years was finally winning out. The Chancellor's mind wandered then, his thoughts going to his past in Vienna, his meager existence, the sights and sounds, the smells and the newspapers, the children in the streets. Their eyes missing, black sockets staring at him. As if stumbling over something in the dark room, a memory startled him out of his reflections. Horrified at the macabre, unnatural image burning into his consciousness, he shook himself back to the present. He was shaking all over now, his body moist with sweat. His wife's body was still warm. The Soviets seemed to be dropping everything they could over his head, the dull thumps and crashes never ceasing for a moment. The Walter PPK was cradled in his lap, the brass cyanide capsule close by. Fate has taken its course. Steeling his battered nerves, Hitler grasped the 2 items in each hand. Taking several calming breaths in preparation, he looked around the bunker that would be his tomb. In the shadowed corner stood him. He wore a deep black suit, his head cocked to the side. Though Hitler could not discern the creature's facial features, he knew there would be none. This was Der Grossmann, a name Hitler knew, and yet could not remember from where or when. Der Grossman did not move, his unnaturally elongated body swaying like the branches of a tree. The creature reached fully to the ceiling of the bunker, yet Hitler knew the creature could become much taller. Though the being did not have any shape or contours to his head, the Chancellor recognized it was looking at him. The shelling above seemed to muffle, and the air in the room began to thicken, and Hitler knew the creature was going to speak.
Strange. You were not to see me as I observed you ending your life.
The monster's voice was like three beings speaking in unison: a sultry female, a young child, and an elderly man. The elderly man held primacy of the three at the moment. Hitler knew the creature could change the primary voice to express itself in place of facial features. Hitler sat frozen, his eyes wide. He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry and his mind was blank. Tremors sat upon his hands again, yet this time he held on to the cyanide and handgun. The noise outside seemed to cease, and the only noise the Führer could perceive was his shuddering breath. Memories, images from nightmares and thoughts he had suppressed flooded his mind. Though the scenes and the events were all different, always were there the black sockets of children, and always the Grossman was present. Places from Hitler's past seemed to be retold in his mind's eye. The creature was there at the Putsch, was at his inauguration in 33, from Sudetenland to Paris. It had been there, watching. The monster in the corner spoke again. This time the voice was led by a woman.
You are remembering me now. This is unexpected.
The Führer was finally able to recapture his voice. What do you mean?
You have been declared a failure, like Hess, Wyrm, und Himmel. That you can see and speak to me now means things have perhaps changed.
The voices seemed to cause pain to Hitler, yet he felt his ire rising at the mentioning of the three men. They all abandoned me, abandoned Germany, at her most dire hour. They would sell us out to the United States, the Slavs, and the 50 Jews. They
failed. I've been at your side the entire time. I'm aware of their failures.
Hitler fell silent, his eyes falling on the handgun and cyanide. They failed me. Germany has failed me. The Untermenschen will destroy everything that my people strove to build. It is all over. The ashen male voice returned.
You are a pathetic man, ruler of a dying empire. Your hubris brought things to where they are now.
The Führer started, his ears not used to hearing such naked accusation and criticism. You presume? The air suddenly tasted the metal, and the light seemed to dim. The children's voice took primacy, and Hitler felt true fear weigh down on his shoulders. I do not presume, manling. Your defeat was known well before now. You will raise your tone and show deference, Bunkeführer. Hitler did not breathe, did not move, as he watched der Grossman lift his arms toward him. Though he stood in a corner several feet away, the hands easily reached the Chancellor's bed. Hitler did not resist, did not flinch, as the hands grasped the cyanide capsule and handgun and pulled them out of his shaking grasp. Der Führer watched as the two items seemed to melt into the miasma that now enveloped the corner. After a moment, the air seemed to return, the darkness formed back into der Grossman's shape, and the voice of the woman was the loudest of the three.
This was not the expected outcome, Adolf Hitler. It is a welcome surprise, both to myself and my master. You have fulfilled the prophecy. You are indeed the Messiah.
The case of Benjamin Bathurst is one of the most famous unexplained disappearances in history. 1809 was a turbulent time in Europe. Various countries were declaring war on each other, and travel between nations was extremely dangerous. Benjamin Bathurst, a British diplomat, was traveling through Berlin under the name Baron de Koch. He and his German courier, Herr Kraus, arrived at the city of Perleberg on November 25th. Bathurst and his companion checked in at the White Swan Inn. There they ordered an early dinner. After he had dined, Bathurst retired to the small room set aside for him at the inn, where he spent several hours writing correspondence and, strangely, burning pieces of paper in the room's fireplace. Their departure had been delayed, and it wasn't until 9 p.m. that they were told that their horses were harnessed to the chaise, a type of horse carriage, and ready to travel. Bathurst was the first to leave the inn, with his attendant following close behind. Instead of entering the chaise from the side nearest to the inn, he went around the front of the horses to enter on the far side. His attendant followed him into the chaise the same way. Upon getting in, the attendant noticed no sign of Bathurst in the chaise, nor was he anywhere near it. In a panic, the attendant gathered some local men to find him. After an hour of searching, they could not find any trace of Bathurst. He was gone. News of his disappearance did not reach England for several weeks, due to the lack of any form of fast communication in the chaotic state of Europe at the time. When word finally reached England, his wife, Philida, immediately departed to Germany to search for her vanished spouse. They arrived to find that Perleberg authorities were already looking into the affair, and that the Captain von Kritzing was put in charge of the investigation. On November 27th, Bathurst's fur coat was discovered in an outhouse on a family farm. December 16th, 2 old women picking berries in the forest found the man's pants in a small clearing in Quitzow, 1 mile north of Perleberg. Investigation eventually revealed that one August Schmidt had worked in the courtyard of the White Swan Inn on the night of Bathurst's disappearance. He later confessed to having followed him with the intentions of robbing him, but no further evidence could be found implicating him for this crime. In March of the following year, Mrs. Bathurst searched Perleberg extensively with the help of a team of trained dogs, but to no avail. To this day, the ultimate fate of Benjamin Bathurst is unknown. Perhaps he was murdered, perhaps he was abducted, or perhaps something unnatural happened that night. We may never know. Shigeko Sasamori wakes up in the middle of the complete blackness. There is no noise. She feels no pain. She sits up and after a while stands up. As she looks around, the blackness slowly disappears like retreating fog, and she begins to see previously unseen things. People walk out of the darkness, their hands outstretched in front of them. It was the 6th of August 1945, when the U.S. military dropped the atomic bomb Little Boy on the Japanese city Hiroshima. During the Second World War, Hiroshima was one of the only cities which had not been bombed in Japan. This left civilians wondering whether there was something special and horrible meant for them. Little did they know. The atomic bomb was unlike any other military weapon. After the U.S. conducted their first nuclear weapon detonation in New Mexico, they realized that they had a truly powerful weapon, powerful enough to end the war. The U.S. decided they could use their newly found firepower on their newest enemy, Japan. The citizens of Hiroshima did not panic when they saw the B-29 bomber flying overhead. They just dismissed it as another routine jet flight above the city. It was World War II after all. Shigeko Sasamori wondered what the black, shiny object was that dropped from the bomber. As it rocketed toward the city, the truth dawned on her. It was a bomb. She had no time to react. Within seconds, the bomb had already reached 1,968 feet, and suddenly the power of the sun was momentarily unleashed upon the helpless city. In fractions of a second, the power of 16,000 tons of TNT utterly destroyed everything within 1.6 kilometers of the blast. All carbon-based life forms instantaneously evaporated. Thousands of innocents died within microseconds. They were the lucky ones. The entire city caught fire. Shigeko was just inside the main 1.6 kilometers and passed out instantly. Within an hour, all the separate fires merged into one large towering blaze of infernos, burning everything. The destroyed city was rampant, with the sounds of billowing fire and the screamers of both pain and grief coming from the suffering residents. The flesh and skin began to peel from the bones of the unlucky survivors. They had to walk with their arms outstretched so as to slightly ease the tremendous suffering that they were going through. As Shigeko saw the army of survivors shamble their way forward, she began to reflect on what happened. Was it a bomb? How big was the bomb? How many people were dead? Where is my family? Poor Shigeko realized that the survivors were all heading toward the Ota River in order to find relief from the horrible fire. She herself also joined the march of the seemingly living dead, later meeting her parents. They were shocked to see her. Her face was covered in third-degree burns, her hair was a black crisp, and her head looked like a leathery black basketball. Her eyes could not be seen, yet she could still see. As the procession of the dead reached the river, near the epicenter of devastation, Shigeko saw the most frightening thing she had ever seen, and will ever see. The river was red. She couldn't make out whether that was because the river was reflecting the red and orange of the surrounding city, or whether the river was simply colored with the blood of the innocent. Hundreds of suffering people were floating in little wooden rafts along the river, all bloody, all burned, all mangled beyond recognition. So many suffering people. Shigeko saw a woman who was trying to suckle an infant. The woman was red and burnt just like everyone else, but the baby? Shigeko couldn't stand to look at it. The image of the poor infant still haunts her to this day. Why? Why were they made to suffer like this? What had they done to deserve this fate? Why was she feeling such pain? Why are almost all of her friends dead? Why? Have you ever heard of the Bloop? It is an ultra-low frequency and extremely powerful underwater sound. It was detected by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the southern part of the Pacific Ocean in 1997. Now, the hydrophone array that picked up the sound was in a very remote part of the ocean. You may want to keep that in mind. In the NOAA's words, the Bloop rises rapidly in frequency over about 1 minute and was of sufficient amplitude to be heard on multiple sensors at a range of over 5,000 kilometers. The NOAA does not believe it was a sound that came from a man-made object, such as a submarine, bomb, or even something like an underwater volcano. Nope. The audio profile of the Bloop resembles those of other marine animals. The kicker? Even if the audio profile resembles that of an animal, it is several times louder than the world's loudest animal, the blue whale. Is it possible that some creature, larger than any whale, is lurking in the depths of the ocean? The assassination of John F. Kennedy started a macabre chain that continues to this day. Oswald killed Kennedy. Jack Ruby killed Oswald. This much we do know. What many people aren't aware of is how far it continued after that. In 1967, while awaiting retrial for the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald, Ruby died in Parkland Hospital, the place of death for both Oswald and JFK. Some say this is due to the negligence of the doctor overseeing him. A few years following this, that same doctor died in an auto accident while on his way home. The driver of the car that struck him would make a full recovery, though the medical costs would bankrupt him and drive him to a life of crime. A store owner acting in self-defense would be the one to claim his life, and so on. Few have kept track of this chain up until now, or how far from Dallas it has actually traveled, but many believe it still continues on after this. Fewer still are sure if it started with Oswald and JFK, or if it perhaps goes further back than that, betraying some unknown transgression from President Kennedy's past. Just be careful out there. Modern playing cards are filled with layers of meaning and symbols that can be traced back centuries. The Four Kings, for example, are based on real rulers. The King of Diamonds represents the wealthy Julius Caesar. The King of Clubs is the brutal Alexander the Great. The King of Spades represents the strong but kind David of Israel. And the King of Hearts represents the emotionally disturbed Charles VII of France. It is this king that we will be dealing with today. It should also be noted that Charles was the only one of the four who was actually there to see the day his face was printed on a playing card, which may rationalize why he acted apart from the others. Charles's visage was put on the King of Hearts at the very beginning of his rule, but he never got a chance to come into contact with playing cards until many years later, when he became very ill with a fever and was informed that he would be bedridden for the rest of his life. It was during this period that Charles began learning card games to pass the time, such as an early version of blackjack, 21, or 21. Charles lay in his bed for 2 years, constantly fiddling with the cards and always getting weaker. As time passed, there were reports that Charles had begun obsessing over the idea that the king being the 13th card in a suit was causing him bad luck. He talked about how he was starting to see the number pop up everywhere, that he was close to figuring out its secret. Of course, his ramblings were blamed on the fever. By the end of the second year, he had been declared insane, and his son, Louis XII, took over the throne. One day, several months after the end of his reign, one of Charles's physicians went to his chamber to find the frail old man standing in the middle of the room wielding a large sword. Before the doctor could react, the king said, "Ils m'ont montré la vérité de Trésor, et il n'est pas signifié pour les mortels," which roughly translates to, "They have shown me the truth of 13, and it is not meant for mortal eyes." Without hesitation, the king proceeded to ram the blade in through the left side of his head, between the ear and temple, until it came out the other side. He wavered a moment before collapsing to the floor, dead. After the incident was announced, and it was made public that the king had gone mad, the image of Charles on the King of Hearts was altered to show his suicide. Although the picture is now shown significantly less graphically, the image of Charles thrusting his sword into his skull can still be found on modern-day playing cards. Perhaps the strangest part of the whole story, however, is the day that Charles chose to kill himself, July 6th, 1462. Whether it was the intention of the king, the facts that 7 plus 6 is 13, and 1 plus 4 plus 6 plus 2 is 13, can only be explained as coincidences. The Ketty murders are an unsolved 1981 American quadruple homicide that took place in Ketty, a former resort town in the foothills of California's Sierra Nevada. The murders took place in Cabin 28 during the late evening of April 11, 1981, and or the early morning of the 12th. The victims were Glenna Sharp, known as Sue, her son John, 15, and his friend Dana Wingate, age 17. On the morning of April 12th, Sue's 14-year-old daughter, Sheila, discovered the bodies of Sue, John, and Dana in the cabin's living room upon returning home from her sleepover next door. All three victims found in the cabin had been bound with electrical wire and medical tape. Examination of the bodies determined that each of the victims had been bludgeoned with a claw hammer, and Sue and John had been stabbed repeatedly. John's throat had been cut. Dana Wingate was also manually strangled and bludgeoned with another weapon. One of the knives discovered at the scene had been used so forcefully that the blade had bent approximately 25 degrees. But it didn't end with the murders. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing, presumably abducted from the scene. 3 young children were found alive in a bedroom adjacent to the crime scene. Greg and Rick Sharp, 10 and 5 years old respectively, apparently slept through it all. Justin, a 12-year-old family friend, was the sole eyewitness. Justin's statements, however, would prove a major source of confusion in the decades to come, as his recounting of the event would change first under a hurried hypnosis with the county sheriff, then under a polygraph, and would change once again under professional hypnosis much later in his adult life. The case would become to be called Cabin 28, after the location, or the Ketty murders, and is said to be a part of the inspiration for the recent movie The Strangers. 29 years later, the Ketty murders remain officially unsolved. It seems a simple, if brutal, crime, but there are elements to it that are utterly baffling, both in the crime scene itself and among the circumstances, people, and events surrounding it. One thing is clear, nothing about this case is simple. Ketty holds many skeletons in its closets. There were in 1981 so many potential perps in town you could have stood in the main street, thrown a dart with your eyes closed and hit one. The Sharp family were in this idyllic little resort town surrounded by child molesters, drug runners, professional criminals, corrupt cops, and businessmen, habitual transients, and at least one known serial killer. Martin Smart, the stepfather of Justin, would become a prime suspect along with his friend John Boobity, a man who would prove to have a long and violent criminal history as a bank robber and one of Chicago's candy bandits. He was also closely associated with Jim Reaney, a former mob enforcer linked to the 1957 disappearance of investigative reporter Amelia Zelko. There were no arrests made. Smart was allowed to leave town that same day. Boobity was also cut loose despite highly suspicious behavior, like insisting on his suffering impotence, lying about being a former cop, and carrying fake ID. Dogs were called in days later to help with the search for Tina Sharp. Her skull would be discovered 3 years later and 95 miles from the crime scene. The rest of her remains were never found. It was discovered that her teacher, now an RSO, had an obsession with the child, and he too became a suspect. Robert Silveria was around at the time, and he was even employed by Plumas County at one point. That he'd been to Ketty is highly likely. He would be later linked to a murder in a hobo camp nearby. Even the owner of the resort had once been a suspect in a similar murder. Several of the men living a stone's throw from Cabin 28 were said to be creepy around children, and the resort's caretaker had been described as a chronic peeping Tom. More than one RSO was connected to the case, closely or incidentally. Evidence held by LE was destroyed or lost. Leads were not followed. Among the various forums dedicated to helping solve the crime and offer the family support over the years, the general consensus had been that LE had really dropped the ball on this one. One good move on LE's part was to consult John Douglas. I am unable to find the date of that consultation or to what extent Mr. Douglas was consulted, but he offered the following profile on the killers. The crime scene reflects that the offender responsible for these murders exhibited great control if he, in fact, acted alone. The crime scene reflects that he did not precisely plan on killing all the victims. With exception of a .177 caliber pellet recovered at the crime scene, all of the weapons appear to have come from the residence of the victims, such as a stake hammer, knife, etc. This indicates that killing the victims was all improbability and afterthought. In order for the subject to gain and maintain control of the victims, he would have had to have some assistance. It appears that victim Dana Wingate was not killed in the same fashion as the other two victims. Beaten, but not stabbed, was made comfortable by receiving a cushion from the couch to rest his head on prior to his execution. Wingate may have been utilized to assist in the binding of the victims. Statements made by associates support that he would probably succumb if threatened rather than strike back at an assailant. Blood is observed on the feet of Gianna Sharp to indicate she was alive when she walked in a pool of blood. This profiler does not know at this writing whose blood was on the feet of Glenna Sharp, noting that this information could modify his profile. According to investigative reports, Glenna Sharp was covered with a blanket after she was killed. This blanket came from her bed. This one act on the part of the offender or offenders is probably the key as to who is responsible for the murders in part or whole. Decades passed. As far as the public eye was concerned, this crime may have simply faded off into statistic status were it not for teacher Josh Hancock setting his students the task of producing a documentary, an assignment for which he agreed to make one of his own. One of his students suggested he look into the then 25-year-old Ketty murders as a topic, and Josh soon became fascinated with the case, which wound up taking over all his spare time. Hancock finished the documentary in 2004, the same year that the now infamous Cabin 28 was torn down to discourage ghost hunters from trespassing on the site. But one documentary wasn't enough. The murders remain unsolved. while the strange and often bewildering facts and rumors surrounding the case only became an increasingly tangled web. More suspects were revealed as time went on, theories and rumors abounded, forum communities flourished, and some were subject to strange internet attacks, as was Hancock himself. People volunteering information lied or could not recall details so many years after the fact. The case was still as clear as mud, and still no resolution for the Sharps or the Wingates. 14 years before the famous Titanic sank into the North Atlantic Ocean, a man named Morgan Andrew Robertson wrote a book about a ship. The title of the book was Futility. The ship was a triple screw, with very few lifeboats, but no one really worried. It was practically unsinkable. It was the largest ship ever created and could hold a capacity of 3,000 passengers and crew members. In the end, 2,500 passengers and crew boarded the ship. Then one April night, moving at 25 knots, the ship struck an iceberg on its starboard side. It was in the North Atlantic when it sank, 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland. More than half of the passengers on board perished. There are only two differences between this fictional ship and the real Titanic. The Titanic was moving at 22.5 knots when it hit the iceberg, and it only had 2,200 passengers and crew on board. As for the name of this fictional ship, it was called the Titan. Many classic horror icons such as Geiger xenomorphs, Silent Hill's Pyramid Head, and other disturbing creatures share common characteristics. Pale skin, dark sunken eyes, elongated faces, sharp teeth, and the like. These images inspire horror and revulsion in many, and with good reason. The characteristics shared by these faces are imprinted in the human mind. Many things frighten humans instinctively. The fear is natural, and does not need to be reinforced in order to terrify. The fears are species-wide, stemming from dark times in the past, when lightning could mean the burning of your tree home, thunder could be the approaching gallops of a stampede, predators could hide in darkness, and heights could make poor footing lethal. The question you have to ask yourself is this: what happened deep in the hidden eras before history began that could affect the entire human race so evenly as to give the entire species a deep, instinctual, and lasting fear of pale beings with dark sunken eyes, razor-sharp teeth, and elongated faces? Just be careful out there. Courage the Cowardly Dog was a show on Cartoon Network when it actually had mostly good shows, airing from 1999 to 2002. It was canceled after 4 seasons, but it's shown on Cartoon Network sporadically. One episode in particular that scared us a lot was the King Ramses Curse. But does anyone really know about King Ramses' backstory? Not really. That's where I come in. About 3 weeks ago, a friend of mine named Ted sent me a link to a website. It was the Cartoon Network website, but there was something off about it. It was darker than I had last remembered it. By that, I mean dark colors. It had been a while since I had been on the site, so I figured they remodeled or something. There was a Courage the Cowardly Dog section of the website. I went to it as it was my favorite show on Cartoon Network, even though it scared the ever-living shit out of me sometimes. One part of the section was, learn the real story of King Ramses. I thought it was some history section of the actual King Ramses. Being a history buff, I clicked on it expecting to learn about King Ramses, or Ramses as he's called sometimes. I was wrong. It started out like any other history bio, but when it got to Ramses' death, however, that's where it took a turn for the worse. The website stated that Ramses, while alive, slaughtered 1 million enemies in battle, but when he returned to Egypt, one of the families of his enemies were waiting for him. They beat him with sticks and then bound him in thorns, the same as what Jesus' crown was made of as he was traveling in cavalry to be crucified. He was taking to what was Persia, and the trip there was brutal. He was bound by his feet and hands, tied to 2 donkeys, he had no protection from the sun, and he was naked as well. He wasn't fed very much, so when he got to Persia he lost half his weight already, but that's when the true torture began. The only mercies his captors granted him was clothing in a green robe. First, they took a prickly plant and whacked him with it repeatedly. The spines of the plant stuck him in and were barbed. Ramses' captors plugged them out with great care to cause as much pain as possible. Next, they took rusty knives and ran them over each of his limbs as carefully as possible as to only cut skin deep. Then, they removed his skin. However, Ramses was still alive. His captors then made him eat his own skin, as to cause the once great king humiliation. He refused. Subsequently, his captors broke both of his elbows. After he had eaten his skin, the captors scraped what meat was left on his head. They painted his skull an orange color for unknown reasons. Then after all that, they continued torturing him. While he was alive, they cut into his body. They removed his intestines, showed them to him, and then fed them to wild dogs. Then they removed his stomach, showed it to him, and then they threw it into a fire. They did this with each organ, alternating between dogs and fire. Then they got to his heart. Ramses was just barely alive. Before the captors left Egypt, they had taken Ramses' prized possession, a slab. Not just any slab. This slab was magical. It had a picture of water, a strange device Ramses had seen in a dream, and locusts. The slab also had a picture of Ramses on it. The Persians had taken the slab to further upset Ramses, but they were unaware of one thing. Ramses had power over the slab, and with his dying breath, he cursed the slab. The second after he died, the slab's picture of him changed to a frightening mummy. The Persians were frightened by this, but thought it was just a trick. They returned the body and slab to the Egyptians, but they themselves found themselves in a bit of a nightmare of their own. For nights after they killed Ramses and returned his body and slab, they experienced nightmares of the king, orange skull, elbows twisting at unnatural angles, and the voice of a demon. Most never woke up from these nightmares, and the ones who did committed suicide. Nobody else experienced King Ramses' wrath again for a while until the 1940s. Here is a timeline of the King Ramses incidents. 3750 BC. 10 Persian nobles died while sleeping. Another 10 committed suicide. 1942. Hitler's Africa Corps discovers the tomb of Ramses. 1 battalion goes missing after making contact with King Ramses after General Rommel removed the slab from his crypt. Rommel realized that this all happened when he took Ramses' slab, so he returned it to his tomb. January 19th, 1957. An Italian archaeologist uncovered the tomb. He removed the slab from the tomb of King Ramses. As he was leaving, he triggered a booby trap. He was trapped inside the tomb, while King Ramses himself appeared before him. He summoned locusts, which ate the man to the bone, killing him. The locusts then picked up the slab and carried it to the tomb. 1999. 2 grave robbers steal the slab and escape the authorities in Egypt. When they returned to the United States, they were chased by the FBI. They buried the slab on a farm in Nowhere, Kansas. King Ramses appeared as they attempted to flee the farm, then killed them after they refused to return the slab. Later, a purple dog named Courage uncovered the slab. His owner, Eustace, threw it out after thinking it was garbage. Later, he took it back after learning how much money it was worth. King Ramses returned, and his 3 drawings became plagues upon the Bag farm. First, the house flooded. Then horrible music played. Next, locusts descended upon the house, eating it whole. Eustace had a change of heart and let Courage give the slab back. However, Eustace changed his mind again and went after it. King Ramses' locusts killed him, and the slab was returned to Egypt.
Created with free version for non-commercial use.
After I read that, I suddenly had a bit of sympathy for Ramses whenever I watched the episode. But something strange also happened. Parents who read it as well demanded that Cartoon Network take down the link, which they did. I don't remember the website, so I may never get to see it again. After the Civil War, Fairfax County, Virginia became more populated, and eventually an insane asylum was built there. No one wanted to live near the asylum, and because of the public outrage, the institution was then shut down later. The administration transferred the patients in 1904, once the process was completed. During the transfer, some of the patients escaped and hid in the surrounding woods and forestry. These individuals were lost, delusional, and dangerous. Most of them were found except Marcus Loster and Douglas Griffin. The local authorities found a trail made by the two men, littered with half-eaten, mutilated bunnies. The trail led deep into the woods to a tunnel crossing a wide creek. There they found Marcus hanging from the tunnel entrance with a note attached to his foot. It read, "You'll never find me, no matter how hard you try. Signed, the Bunny Man." That tunnel has been called Bunny Man Bridge ever since. The legend says that if you walk all the way down to the tunnel at around midnight, the Bunny Man will grab and hang you from the entrance of the bridge. Strange deaths and phenomena have constantly been connected with the Bunny Man Bridge. There was a young man from Clifton, Virginia, who came to the bridge while traveling. Later, he killed his parents and dragged their bodies into the woods to hang him from the bridge before he killed himself. 1943, 3 youths were found dead, hung from the bridge. Their bodies were slashed open and all had notes attached to their feet, all of which stated, "You'll never catch the Bunny Man." In 2001, after hearing the tale, 6 local students and a guide searched the area, only to find mutilated bunny parts during their search. They soon left the forest after they heard noises and caught glimpses of figures in the woods. In 1963, the U.S. government established a research base on Lake Vostok in Antarctica. The team of engineers and scientists were tasked with drilling into the subglacial lake and researching the life within. A second clandestine reason was its potential use for the military. In 1966, the team began drilling, and by April of 1966, they reported breaking through the ice. The base fell silent. A research operation went underway, but just before its launch in May 1966, the base sent out one last transmission. The contents of the tape were mostly purged after its reception, but the surviving audio gives a clear warning. Stay away from Lake Vostok. Whatever the contents of the rest of that tape, the US government did something which it had never done before, and which it hasn't done since. It listened. Mary. This old castle is drafty. The night wind bounces off the walls, making queer noises. Sometimes they sound like my name. I try not to listen, but as I lie here awake with 1,000 anxieties swimming within me, anything that stirs my senses is a welcome diversion. Mary. There is much to be troubled by. The people hate me. That can no longer be denied. They hate me, in no small measure, thanks to the man I have chosen to marry. A man who now, for all I know, lies far away in the bed of someone else. How I long for him. These sinful memories of the handful of nights he's come to my chamber, they drive me almost as solitary acts of depravity. And how far have I fallen to even think such things? How can I ever hope to bring my people back to the true faith if I myself have thought so impure? Mary. That wind again. It frightens me. It touches not my skin, and yet I am chilled nonetheless. The people are cold to me. I must warn them to me. God in heaven knows I've tried. I've tried kindness, forgiveness, mercy, all to no avail. They have forced my hand, made me to apply a different kind of heat. It pains me to know how many have burned. My heart aches. Tears sting my eyes. But these things they do not see. They see only themselves and the others who have fallen as martyrs. And for what? Lies. Lies that were started by my father, and, so they hope, shall be perpetuated by the whore's daughter once I'm gone. Treasonous, blasphemy. Why have I allowed her to live? Why? Because if I did not, there should be another rebellion. One which, I fear, would not fail. Mary! There it is again. It was my name, surely, but not just my name. There is something with it, a word before it. I cannot tell what it is. My agitation compels me to movement, and I pace the floor of my chamber. I shall have no rest tonight. It has been so long since my sleep was deep and unbroken. Perhaps in childhood, all those years ago. Mary! Again, is it coming closer? What is it saying? Witchcraft. It must be. Vengeance. They mean to destroy me. Perhaps it is she, my sister, spawn of the whore on whom is placed the burden of so many souls' damnation. She means to get rid of me. She means to take my throne and cast this land even further into the pit of sin. I will not allow it. Our Father who art in heaven, Mary. It is clearer now. It is coming from the next room. There's someone here. Why do the guards not come? Can they not hear it? Is it meant by some devil for my ears alone? Mary. I can stand it no longer. I must know who or what it is that calls me. I must know what they call me, even if it be the enemy. Mary. The mirror. That is where the voice is coming from. I still cannot understand the first word. Good Lord, protect me. There is a light flickering in the glass. The longer I gaze upon it, the clearer the picture becomes. I now stand face to face with a woman staring out from the mirror. She is very young, no more than a child. The light that allows me to see her is a candle she holds before her. Even in the dim light, I can see that her hair is cut strangely, and her clothing is a long way from decent. Hers is the voice, not the wind's. I can hear her now, the name by which she calls me, clearer than ever. Bloody Mary! Silence. A clap of thunder rends the air. Her eyes grow wide. She sees me. Screams fill my ears. I cannot tell which are hers and which are mine. Her light goes out, and she is gone. My chamber is invaded by armed men. They find me in a heap on the floor, quaking and weeping bitterly. Word will reach the people soon enough. A fine state for their hated queen. Okay, so I know this is being released the day after Halloween, specifically All Saints Day 2019, but I figured since a lot of people do Halloween stuff early, and today people are putting all the Halloween stuff away, for those of you who actually really like Halloween, I figure I may as well have this premiere today, so that those of you who are already going through Halloween withdrawals can have another quick fix before the season ends for everyone else. So thank you very much for joining here. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. I don't do these kinds of things often, but if you want me to do more dramatic readings, please let me know in the comment section. I'm even willing to do collabs in some cases, and in fact I am planning on doing some collabs soon. But in addition, I do have a Ko-fi account if you want to donate to it. That's completely up to you. I'm not going to hide anything behind a paywall other than like maybe bloopers and stuff like that. But yeah, if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day. God bless. Peace, Pacham, and bye.